everyone. Welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Monday, the 11th of September, where I wanted to talk a little bit about what literature is and some of the reasons why we read it and why we write about it. Last class, I had reviewed the syllabus and the course outline, and I'm hoping that that was clear to you. But if you have any questions, please let me know. I also asked you to introduce yourselves, and I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce myself, which starts for me in terms of New York City, which is where I was born and raised, though I attended college in upstate New York, the University of Rochester. I like to tell the story of how I looked at college catalogs and was very impressed with their marketing material that students could experience, quote, real winters, unquote, when they attended that institution. Let's just say I was very young and naive. I thought of real winters as being romantic, and they were romantic, but they were also challenging. Nevertheless, there I am in college, majoring in English, minoring in psychology. I'm absolutely positively certain I'm going to be a lawyer. So that goes to show how your career goals can change over the course of your educational endeavors. I took a Shakespeare class, fell in love, realized that really what I wanted to do was to study literature. So I ended up going to a graduate school that did not have real winters. It was located in Southern California, UCLA. They had other things, earthquakes and mudslides and some of the most expensive real estate in the nation, but they didn't have real winters. I spend my time focusing on Shakespeare and his contemporaries, finish up graduate school, begin teaching, and I realized that I really want to return home. My definition of home being anything on the East Coast. So I begin applying to positions, and I am offered an interview at a school I'd never heard of before, Greenfield Community College. So you know how this story will end. And I remember being very impressed, and that the community really lived up to its name, that it was a place with fields that were green. And California was in the midst of a drought at that time. We did not have green fields. So we talked a little bit about my transition to Massachusetts from California, my interview committee and I. And I remember being assured by my interview committee that the winters here in Massachusetts are, quote, not that bad, unquote. I'm still young and naive. And off I go. I go back to California, pack up my things, and move to Massachusetts. In the 1993-94 academic year, you might know this year, it's a historical year. It was one of the worst winters in Massachusetts history, which broke a large number of records for snow and ice and snowfall. No one was prepared for it. I definitely wasn't prepared for it. But that's a little bit of my story. I stayed regardless. I teach mostly English classes, but I also teach some personal communication skills classes and some media classes. And as I indicated, you're not required to respond to your classmates in the discussion forum, but you are required to read their responses and to read my responses in turn, because I've responded to all of you and welcoming you to the class. So the one piece of the syllabus that I didn't have a chance to get to that I wanted to start with today was about plagiarism. And it used to be a clear-cut discussion. And you'll note that in the section about plagiarism, I tried very hard not to plagiarize by making sure I documented where I got my information from, which was the Modern Language Association. And basically, plagiarism is using someone else's language or their ideas and not acknowledging the source. So I was very careful not to plagiarize by acknowledging my source. Because when you're not acknowledging the source, it's considered to be a kind of theft. In this instance, it would be intellectual theft rather than property theft. But the consequences could be just as severe in terms of plagiarism. If you were to get off easy, so to speak, you could flunk that assignment. And if you weren't to get off easy, you could actually be expelled with a notation on your transcript that you were expelled because of plagiarism. As long as you give credit for your work, then you're fine. You're not plagiarizing. and I would tell two stories. In fact, I still do, about plagiarism. One that actually occurred to me early on in my teaching career. I'm reading a set of papers and I realized something sounds familiar. Now, this was early on in my career, before the internet, so I couldn't really rely on some of the sources that exist for teachers to determine if things have been plagiarized, such as Turnitin.com, where I could put in a sentence or a paragraph and do database search for things that have been plagiarized off the internet. I had to rely on my memory, and it really wasn't that difficult for me to figure out that what I was reading was taken just about verbatim from our class textbook, with a few changes here and there, a couple of mechanical mistakes. I don't know if that was done deliberately so that I wouldn't be suspicious, or if the writer was just a poor plagiarist, but regardless, it wasn't difficult for me to figure out. The better story did not occur to me, but happened around the same time period to a middle-aged professor. That part is important. He's reading a set of papers, realizes something is familiar, can't go to the internet to look it up because of the time period. The internet really wasn't established in the way that it is now. Had to rely on his memory, and after some careful consideration, realized he hadn't read this before. He had written it himself decades earlier when he was an undergraduate student. It was one of his old papers. It had something to do with a fraternity recycling papers. And all I know is that I feel perhaps a bit sorry for this student. Not only were they plagiarizing, but they also were plastered all over the academic newspapers. There are such a thing as academic newspapers, because of the absurdity of the whole thing. What's the likelihood that you would actually submit in your own professor's work? And then I would usually talk about that I've embedded opportunities in the class to improve your performance, such as revisions, and that I really want to focus on thinking and analysis. You probably realize that the term critical thinking is something that oftentimes is used in academia. It doesn't mean to be critical. It means to ask questions, to analyze, to interpret. What I like to say toddlers do quite well. They ask lots of questions, especially the question why, which might be the $1,000,000 question. I've always said that what is about high school. That's what you learn in high school, the what. And the why is something that you try to grapple with in college. Why doesn't have a simple answer. That was usually the ending of my conversation about plagiarism and my reminding students that our writing assignments would be critical writing assignments based on your own interpretations, not research assignments, because I didn't want you to use outside sources and then to have to try to discern which pieces of information were yours and which were from someone else. That oftentimes it can get kind of confusing, that I really wanted to encourage thinking. And that would pretty much be the conversation. Everything has changed in the last 6 months or so. I suspect you know what I'm talking about. Artificial intelligence, specifically ChatGPT, but really all artificial intelligence programs. And I encourage you not to use artificial intelligence in this class for a multitude of reasons, and I'm going to talk about some of them. The first being that artificial intelligence is growing exponentially. I find that personally to be quite frightening. We've seen movies like this. For instance, The Terminator. If you've ever seen it before, you know how easy it is for technology to run amok. It's an old story, something that's talked about in Frankenstein as well. But it's much more than that. The speed in which it's occurring. I don't know if our society is prepared for the social and the economic changes that are going to occur. These changes should be something that occur over decades, not weeks, which is what's happening now. The third issue, and I think it's quite serious, the term, I've been doing quite a bit of reading about this, that has been used is hallucination. That artificial intelligence has the propensity to hallucinate. I think of it as lying myself, but nevertheless, the idea that it gives incorrect information. Not because the algorithm has made an error, but it has in theory, made a decision, which I also find quite frightening, not to give accurate information. And I have no idea what this means in terms of our ability to be able to control artificial intelligence. But I do find it rather problematic that we can't trust necessarily all of the information that we're being given. A good example, and you might have read about it in the news, was an attorney who used some artificial intelligence to put together a legal brief in a courtroom case. And he actually asked the artificial intelligence ChatGPT, are all of these court cases valid? And he was assured that they were, and even given information about where they appeared in various law journals. Well, he presented his case, and the judge, being old-fashioned, actually looked up these cases in paper documents, the old-fashioned books, and found that these cases didn't exist, despite the assurances from artificial intelligence. Needless to say, this attorney is in quite a bit of trouble. Nevertheless, I put all of these pieces together, and these are some of the many reasons why I encourage you not to use ChatGPT or other forms of artificial intelligence in this class, particularly if we think about what the purpose of the class is about. I mean, ultimately, it's about learning, but it also is, as we talked about, understanding literature and film. And many of you had indicated in your discussion forum responses that you're very excited about understanding more about literature and film. The way to really learn it and understand it is to work with it on your own, which is why so much of the class is basically divided up so that a good portion of your evaluation are the discussion forum responses, which are based on your reflections. A good portion of the class is based on the first paper, which is due about midway through the semester, which you can rewrite for a higher grade. And the second paper, which is due towards the ending of the semester. And finally, our final examination, which is a synthesis of basically everything. In fact, because of this, it's made me even rethink some of the assignments that we'll be doing this semester that I will talk about in greater depth over the next couple classes. So I've made some changes to some of the assignments that I've given in the past to really try to encourage thinking rather than just regurgitation of facts or information that can be found in a book or electronically. It really is more about understanding. So that's my long-winded conversation about artificial intelligence and about plagiarism. So you'll also note that in the way that I've constructed this class, I'm not using the electronic grading program. There's still enough of the dinosaur in me that I use a combination of electronic, but also hard copy. So I'll be keeping hard copies of things, though as you know, the class is divided up into fourths, the discussion forum, paper 1, paper 2, and finally the final. But certainly if you needed or wanted some information about where you are with grades, you can always ask me, and I'll be happy to share that with you. What I had assigned today were a series of readings that I'm hopeful that you were able to get to, though if you weren't able to get to them, please don't panic. These are introductory readings that basically set the stage for the literature and film that we will be watching over and reading over the course of the semester. As you know, I had indicated that you could use any edition of the text, but I've given you the page numbers for the 11th edition, which is the edition that I believe is available in the GCC library or the GCC bookstore, and there also is a copy on reserve in the GCC library, though I'm not sure if it's necessarily the 11th edition. But you can find these topics even if your page numbers are different. The first is reading imaginative literature, and those were, at least in my version, pages 1 through 7, to try to define what literature is, which I suppose in the broadest sense of the term is any kind of writing. So for instance, you could read a piece of literature, let's say, about a kitchen appliance, because it's giving you information in written form. But usually when we talk about literature, at least in the context of a class like this, we're talking about fiction, something that's much more creative and imaginative. It's more than just giving information. There's storytelling involved with it, which is something that I think is just about a universal attraction. It's one of the first things kids show interest in. They want to be told stories, and these stories teach us about ourselves and about others. That's the greatness of literature. The text states, and I think they state it quite well, that literature doesn't lend itself to a tidy definition. Certainly, you can look up the Webster's Dictionary definition, but some thoughts to consider about literature, at least in the way that we're using it in this class. It should broaden your perspectives. Yes, it can entertain, but it does more than entertain and just generate profit. It provides some level of social commentary. It uses language in interesting ways. And it's interesting how oftentimes the perception of literature can change from generation to generation. There's something called canon. Those works that are considered by scholars and critics and teachers, because scholars and critics and teachers are supposedly the experts. These works that are considered to be the most important to read and study. Moby Dick, a text you might have heard of, interestingly was not considered to initially be canonical when it first came out. It wasn't viewed as literature. It was viewed to be the study of whales, and it was put in the section in the library about whales. It was only later that it was, quote, rediscovered, unquote, and thought to have the elements associated with literature, and now it's become one of those canonical texts. But there's been great debate about canon and which texts we read and which texts we don't, and which texts are considered to be great and which texts aren't. Oftentimes these are sociological and political issues and questions to raise. Why are so many texts male-centric? Why are so many texts European? Why are so many texts written from the past? So certainly there's been debate about expanding the canon so that there are other voices and perspectives and viewpoints. But does that mean that we add to the canon so that there's additional reading? Does that mean we subtract some texts and add others? So I'm more of the school that you try to balance a little bit of everything, understanding that you can't read everything. It's a question we will grapple with over the course of the semester. How do we evaluate quality? And of course, quality is subjective. And how does one make a determination if something should or should not be included in the canon? Now, there's an article that I wanted you to read. You'll notice that beneath this video, I've got our class notes. In fact, these are the actual my notes that I use for class. And one of the elements in the first section about reading imaginative literature is a very interesting article that I found in the New York Times about your brain on fiction, where there were some studies done on brains to try to get a sense of what happens in our brain when we're actually reading fiction, a description, a metaphor, an emotional exchange between characters. And that what studies have found, and you can click on that PDF and read the article yourself, but I'm going to summarize it for you. But I've included the PDF in the first section under Reading Imaginative Literature, is that classical language regions are involved in how the brain interprets written words. Scientists have used things like EKG to measure brains. So that perhaps is one of the reasons why our brains can feel so alive when we are reading a particularly interesting passage. Words like lavender, synonyms, soap, that are associated not just with language, but also with smells, activate both areas of the brain, the language area of the brain, but the scent area of the brain. A study, and multiple studies are noted here from multiple cultures. This one was from Spain, asking participants to read words with strong odor associations, along with neutral words. And when subjects looked at Spanish words, of course, this was a study from Spain, like perfume and coffee, the area of their brain associated with scent lit up. And when they read words like chair and key, the area of their brain associated with scent did not light up. And similar things happen with metaphors, which are the comparisons of two seemingly dissimilar things, but that have some connection with one another. So, for instance, if you're using a metaphor or figure of speech, such as "I've had a rough day," it's so familiar to us, we could treat it purely as words and nothing more. So, a study was done at Emory University at this time, where metaphors involving texture were read by participants, and the sensory cortex, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for perceiving texture, became active when metaphors like the singer had a velvet voice or he had leathery hands. This did not occur when the same thing was said but without words associated with tactile sensations, such as the singer had a pleasing voice or he had strong hands. More research, in this instance about motion, was done. This was in a French study, and participants once again were scanned when they were reading sentences such as "John grasped the object" or "Pablo kicked the ball." The scans revealed activity in the motor cortex, and that's the area that coordinates the body's movements. And even more interesting, perhaps, is that the activity was concentrated in one part of the motor cortex when the movement described was arm-related, another part when the movement concerned the leg. So the conclusion is that the brain doesn't seem to make a whole lot of distinction about reading about an experience and actually encountering it in real life, which is nothing short of fascinating. That means the closest we can get to experiencing a real life experience outside of actually having it ourselves is reading about it. Think about the possibilities involved in that for our understanding different people, different societies, or for us just being able to broaden our horizon to experiences we could never have in our day-to-day lives. So fiction, with its details and its metaphors and its descriptions, offers a rich replica, basically, of reality. And in fact, the argument has been that fiction even goes beyond simulating reality to give readers that experience that's unavailable off the page, to enter into someone else's thoughts and feelings. And yes, someone can tell us about their thoughts and feelings. That's very different from actually experiencing someone's thoughts and feelings. So, and that ultimately, this is very similar, or at least our brain thinks it's very similar, having a real life encounter and reading about a fictional encounter. So there is a good amount of overlap used by the brain to understand stories and the networks used to navigate interactions with other individuals, especially when we're trying to figure out the thoughts and feelings of others. So I also teach a class in interpersonal communications. I find this to be fascinating because interpersonal communications is such a challenge for all of us. As I tell my students, there are no experts in interpersonal communications. It's something that we're all grappling with. So narratives can offer a unique opportunity to identify with characters' longings and frustrations, guess at their hidden motives, track their encounters with friends and enemies. And it found, even one study, that individuals who frequently read fiction seem to be better able to understand other people, empathize with them, see the world from their perspective, even after researchers accounted for the possibility that more empathetic individuals might prefer reading novels. So basically, fiction, and this is a quote, is a particularly useful simulation because negotiating the social world effectively is extremely tricky, requiring us to weigh up a myriad of interacting instances of cause and effect. And just as computer simulations help us get to grips with complex problems like flying a plane or forecasting the weather, so novels, stories, and dramas can help us understand the complexities of social life. So I moved beyond the first section about reading imaginative literature to how can you read literature from an academic perspective, from a professional perspective. And this actually became a profession. People do this for a living. Usually they are university professors. And this started around the 1800s, and they called themselves the formalists because they were looking at the formal aspects of a work, things like the language that was used and the structure and the tone that was being used. And in this section, pages 1641 to 1662, I know the readings are kind of dense. Again, these are not the pieces of literature or fiction that we will be reading. I just wanted to give you an overview of some of the different ways that some of the professionals have gone about reading literature. In the 1940s to the 1960s, which was a time period where individuals began to branch out and study literature in different ways. They needed to call themselves something. They call themselves the new critics. I think that is an unfortunate term because what is new eventually becomes old. Nevertheless, the idea was close readings of the text. You didn't have to have a strong background in literature in order to do a close reading of the text, to look for things like language or irony, where you have something that's unexpected with a twist. For instance, let's say a firehouse burns down. That's ironic because firemen are, and firefighters, I should say, not firemen. Firefighters and firehouses are devoted to putting out fires. Paradox, two seemingly contradictory terms that in reality support one another. Or symbolism, which is representational, and literature is oftentimes a representation of something else. We use symbols all the time in our lives. So, for instance, something like the flag is a concrete symbol of a representation of something that is not concrete, a feeling, patriotism. A metaphor comparing two dissimilar things and showing the similarity between them, so forth and so on. Or characterization, being able to talk about the characters and how they interact with one another. And the narration, who's telling the story and how does that influence the story. Even just the plot, what's happening in the story, and then talking about why those events are important. This is a very common way for teachers to talk about literature because it means that you can take any student, regardless of where they are in their learning process, read a piece of literature and begin to analyze it. Obviously, you'll get a much more complex analysis from a college student than you would from an elementary school student, but both levels can engage in literary analysis. Right around the time of the 1960s, people began to specialize in particular areas. I don't think it's accidental that it coincided with some challenges in the job market for professors. Biographical critics, as they call themselves, focused on author biography, and that knowing author biography helped you understand the text. So certainly knowing something about Shakespeare's life can be useful to understanding Shakespeare. That's just common sense. However, we need to be careful with biography. Just because an author has had a particular life experience, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's reflected in their text. After all, they are writing fiction. Psychological critics use psychology, mental states, as a way to analyze literature, whether it was using psychology to analyze the mental states of characters, or perhaps psychology to analyze the mental state of the author, or psychology to analyze the mental state of the reader, perhaps all of the above. Historical critics looked at past events, the history of events, and how those influenced the telling of a particular story. Marxist critics looked at socioeconomics. So if you're familiar with Marx and some of his socioeconomic theories, and that everything is based upon class and about money. New historicist critics looked at history through the lens of culture, those groups to which we all belong, where we share certain behaviors and values and attitudes and beliefs. Again, not all of us share all those things. There are individual differences, but usually there's a predictive element associated with culture. Gender critics look just at that, gender, whether they were looking at the male, the female, or non-binary, or some combination thereof. Mythological critics looked at myth, those traditional and legendary stories that oftentimes are shared culturally. Reader response critics looked at not so much the text or the author, but the reader and how the reader or groups of readers were responding to a particular text. Deconstructionist critics did just that. They deconstructed texts. They took them apart to look for contradiction. And their argument was that there is contradiction in everything. So basically, the text falls apart upon itself because of its contradiction. It actually is a philosophical theory that came from a French philosopher, Jacques Derrida. All of these interpretations and ways of reading literature have strengths and weaknesses associated with them. And particularly in the beginning phases of examining literature, I encourage you not necessarily to grab onto one of these schools of interpretation and state, well, I am a gender critic or I am a psychological critic, but instead to read the text or watch the film and let the text or the film determine for you what lens might be most appropriate for interpretation. And what you will probably find is that there are multiple lenses that you could use for interpretation. It's just a question of focus. So, the third section that I had you read for today was about reading fiction, reading it more than just for entertainment or for escapism or also for information, for reading it carefully and deliberately where you are rereading a text. I suggest 3 readings of a text or 3 viewings of a film if you're really going to do it from an academic perspective. The first time for plot, what's happening? The second time for interpretation, analysis. The third time to refresh your memory before you're going to write or talk about it. I understand that 3 viewings or rereadings may not be possible, but certainly if you're going to take things seriously, then the more you read or watch, the greater your understanding of the text or the film will be. And you should be annotating, taking notes of the films that you're watching or the text that you're reading. Again, something we don't do when we are consuming these texts or films purely for entertainment or for understanding, perhaps. And you can also write journals, informal responses to the readings and to the films as part of your annotation. There are questions that are oftentimes included at the ending of texts that are included in your textbook. These questions can serve as a kind of hint as to what to read for. In fact, I've even had students say that they like to read the questions before they actually read the text, so they know what to look for. Some students say they don't want spoilers, so they like to read the questions afterwards. I oftentimes use those questions as basis for our class discussions as well, or perhaps our discussion forum analysis. So in that section of reading, you're given the story of an hour. Very short story, about a page or so. And you're shown how it could be annotated, how somebody could take text in the margins. There are reasons why those margins are so large in textbooks. And the reason why is because you are being encouraged to write in those margins. It costs more money to print up textbooks with large margins. You're using more paper. And also how to write a journal if you so felt the need. In fact, I used to assign journals in my class, but as I indicated, I've made some changes, in part because of artificial intelligence, but not necessarily solely because of artificial intelligence. So instead of journals, we're focusing more on the discussion forum responses, so it's worth a greater part of your grade than they have been in my previous classes in the past. So, I also wanted to talk about writing and analyzing about film. As I had indicated that I really didn't have the heart to order another textbook purely on film. So what I will be doing is supplementing the film portions of this class with things like handouts. So I've included a handout that you can find in your syllabus and other documents folder that I encourage you to print up because I do like hard copies. But of course, if you just want to access it electronically, you certainly can. It's available in PDF form so that you can download it, but I also have included it in the text above all of the downloading documents, or out of all of the documents that can be downloaded for the class in the event that you have difficulty downloading. So this particular handout talks about how to read a film. And yes, we're used to watching film, but we can read a film, analyze and interpret a film much in the same way we read a text. And both film and literature utilize storytelling. But in films, it's the pictures that tell the stories in addition to dialogue. In literature, it's the words that tell the story. So when we are analyzing film, we have to pay attention to more in some respects because we have to look at the images as well as process the dialogue. chances are we've likely had more experience watching films than we've had reading books. Certainly, it's probably an easier exercise in some ways because you don't have to use your imagination quite as much when you're watching a film because the images are given to you. You don't have to imagine them in your mind. There are both pros and cons to that. Many times individuals will see a film version of a book and say that the book is better, and it usually is. And there are multiple reasons for that. There are, certainly challenges with film in terms of length and in terms of the need to generate profit, particularly if it's going to be a popular film that usually results in changes from the original text itself. Plus, there is something to be said about our using our imagination rather than having somebody dictate to us what it is we should be seeing. Film is really the only literary form where the text moves but also has a sense of permanence. Yes, we could watch a drama where the story is presented to us, but once we watch it live, it's gone. Though certainly we could record that, but watching a recorded version of a live drama and watching the actual live drama itself, those are very two different things, as we will talk about as the semester progresses. Just even think about the term that we talk about with film. We say motion pictures because they are pictures that basically show motion. They show rather than tell, which is what good literature aspires to do. And if something is shown in a film, it's likely to be important, just like if something is mentioned in a text, it's likely to be important. If it's not mentioned in the text, it's likely not to be important. If it's not shown in the film, it's likely to not be important. There is, however, in film a term that comes from Hitchcock. You might be familiar with the famous director Alfred Hitchcock. A MacGuffin. It's a deliberate misdirection. It's something that's shown in a film to try to trick you into thinking that that's going to be important, but it's really something else. It's a kind of misdirection. And these film images that we are shown, they offer suggestion. They offer, much like what literature does with symbolism and metaphor. There's extended meaning involved in these. Now, when we're watching a film, the camera is doing the thinking for us, as well as the director. The director is basically giving information to the camera operator as to what to show us. And while the director is primarily responsible for the film, think of like some of our directors that we've deified over the years, something like Spielberg. The actors are also important, but the actors are oftentimes given direction from the director unless they are A-list actors. And then they can pretty much do whatever it is they want to do because they have a certain amount of gravitas in the system. Perhaps this is why so many actors want to be directors, because they oftentimes have more control as a director than as an actor. But the camera is going to select what we see. This is very different than when we're watching a drama where we have a holistic view of something on a stage, or when we're watching a concert and we have a holistic view of a stage, and we get to decide where to put our eyes, what to attend to. The camera does that for us. So, we can certainly analyze film much better now than we can in the past just because of the advances in technology. Being able to have home access to film, whether it be through streaming or DVD or some combination thereof, allows us to watch film outside of movie theaters, which means that we can watch and rewatch and reflect in a way that we usually do that with reading, and that we can reread. It was something you couldn't do when you were watching a film in a movie theater, and that was the only access that you had to that particular film. And film, much like literature, is oftentimes classified by a genre or a kind of category. It's something to consider when we're watching film. It's not easy to show in a film internal mental states. In literature and text, it's easier because we can talk a little bit about what a character is thinking. The author can tell us the character thought. It's a little bit more difficult to do that in film. Yes, we can do that through voiceover. We could do that through actions and behavior. We can do that through dialogue. But in that instance, it's a little bit more challenging. We talk about movie magic, and I think magic is a good term. And it's not just limited to special effects. Basically, films are made up of frames, single shots. Each shot should tell a story. You put all of those shots, those single pictures together, 24 of them is 1 second of film. And then scenes are a series of frames that tell a story. And sequences are multiple scenes that tell a story. But basically, that's all film is that it's just a series of single shots. And movies generally can be divided up into 3 acts. The first being about 30 minutes or so, an introduction to the characters in the story. The second, between 30 to 60 minutes, where we're presented with conflict. Just about every story has conflict. There has to be some tension that needs to be resolved, or else there really is no story. And then Act 3, usually about 30 minutes or so, resolution. Not that a film has to follow that criteria, certainly in regards to length. I just finished watching Oppenheimer, superb film. I highly recommend it. It's a 3-hour film, but I can tell you that it goes very quickly. I think it needed to be told in 3 hours. But it's the same with reading, let's say, a novel. Some novels can be 200 pages, some novels can be 2,000 pages. So it's a question of the story that needs to be told. But certainly, you have to think about some of the limitations you've got with watching a film as an audience member, as opposed to reading. If you're going to be showing this in a theater, then chances are most audience members are going to be able to tolerate something between 2 to 4 hours. When you're reading, obviously, you have much more flexibility in terms of stopping and starting. Some considerations when you're watching film, and these are things that we'll talk about over the course of the semester. The cinematography, the movement, where characters are and how they move. That's something that's determined by somebody. So if you've ever seen these film award shows, there are awards for things like cinematography or choreography. So choreography determines movement. Cinematography is about the actual filming of it, which is a skill in and of itself. If you've ever tried to take a picture of something, you know that some people are better photographers than others. Sound, the audio, which is more than just dialogue, but it also has to do with sound effects, for instance, and also with musical scores. The scene framing, what is it that we're going to be seeing through the eyes of the camera? And how is that scene going to be shot? How is it going to be cut? How will it fade? Will it dissolve into the next scene? So how is the editing done? The camera angles, because the camera is our eyes for us, basically. The lighting. Lighting becomes incredibly important. And again, award shows will give awards just for lighting. Medium shots usually provide the most information as compared to close-ups that usually focus on one element, or long shots. Usually they're too far to focus on any element. And again, choices have to be made about what kind of mood is established by the different kinds of shots. Dollying is a term you may or may not have heard of with cameras, where you're running the camera back and forth. Zooming is another term that you might have heard of with characters, where you're getting closer or farther away. Panning, yet another camera term, where you've got a stationary camera that's moving side by side. And as I indicated, sound is more than just dialogue. It can be sound effects, musical score, even the kind of film that the director chooses to use, color versus black and white. Obviously, in the early days of film, there was no choice. There was only black and white. But now there is choice. Black and white oftentimes is used to suggest distance or nostalgia, or to set some kind of mood or some kind of tone. So those are just some things that I wanted you to consider about writing about film and analyzing about film. Our next class, we get to talk some more about writing about fiction, writing about film. I'll have a handout for you. Just the writing process itself, and some literary terms and film terms we'll be using over the course of the semester. So what's left is our class attendance question, which would be due on Wednesday the 13th on our discussion forum. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. That'll give you an idea of what we would have talked about in a class discussion. And the question, which I post in the notes below, but you can also access it through our class discussion forum. What do you think makes a piece of literature or film worthy of being included in that canon, those works that are considered to be great? and why? So, as you can tell from this question, and you will tell this from many of my questions, there really are no right or wrong answers. I'm really more interested in your thinking and your reasoning. And I ended that with a cartoon underneath it that might be applicable to your answering this question. I'm not sure. But it's about banning books and banning films. I'm not a fan of censorship. I believe everything should be viewed and seen and then discussed as to why it does or does not have value to it. But as you know, we live in challenging political times right now where texts have come under scrutiny as to being appropriate or inappropriate. And you can see this little cartoon for yourself about banned books and what could happen with banned books, that they become the fodder for actually analysis because they're banned. There's got to be some reason why they are raising so much controversy. But we will continue to examine this idea as the semester progresses. Where we are is talking a little bit about what makes a piece of literature or film worthy of being included in the academic canon. I'm very eager to read your responses, and I'll respond to all of you in turn. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class. As I had indicated, I'll always have a video posted on Monday and Wednesday by 10:30. My hope is to have those videos before Monday and Wednesday at 10:30, but certainly by Monday and Wednesday at 10:30. Again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next Wednesday talking about literature. That would pretty much put closure on our introduction to literature, and also talking about film, and that would put a closure to our introduction to film before we actually start watching some films and reading some literature and interpreting them ourselves. Take care. Bye-bye.